I'm here today with Amelia Dress. Amelia is a writer, pastor, parent, and passionate advocate for children. A graduate of Union Presbyterian Seminary, she's ordained in the United Church of Christ, and in addition to church ministry, Amelia has worked in human services and education. She especially enjoys the intersection between these fields. She's written about the spirituality of education, doing theology with children, and mindful parenting. She's also written several curricula for both adults and children. So Amelia, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Well, it's really our pleasure to have you here with us today. So what I didn't mention is Amelia is coming out with a new book called The Hopeful Family. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But she also previously published another book called This is the Mystery of Easter. So Amelia, maybe you could just kind of share a little bit more about your background with folks and talk maybe a little bit about the first book before we dive into talk more about the second book.
Yeah. As you mentioned, I have this kind of interweaving between education and ministry in my vocational kind of background and history. And those things are really the things that I like to write about, the places where those come together. So how do we show up with our whole selves, and how does living spiritually impact who we are out in the world? And a piece of that, because I have loved doing so much work with children, and one of the things that's important about my ministry right now, as I see it, is that I continue to be in a place where I can work with children and adults, because I think that's so important. And I think that helping children do theology is crucial for helping them to not just be people of faith, but those critical thinking, critical being skills out in the world. So that's really how I got to writing that first book, the picture book. This is the Mystery of Easter. It started as a children's sermon. I was looking at how do we do Easter? How do we tell the Easter story in a progressive Christian setting in a way that is rich and deep and invites them into that mystery? And I do see that being done well in some places, but overall not as much. Overall, it is either oversimplified or kind of brushed over, or has a more evangelical bent to it than is really where my background is coming from. So the children's sermon that I did became one of those that I did for a couple years, and somebody said to me, "I want to know what book you're reading that out of." And then I was like, well, that's not a book. I'm just doing that. And then I thought, well, why isn't that a book? So that's how that came to be a book. And that I self-published that one. It's available free on my website. I just wanted this as a model out there for people. And that was just last year at this time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that I was doing that. It has been an amazing year. And as we were talking about before, this is one of those projects that unfolded and fell on me, and it was busy, but it was also fulfilling and wonderful to do.
Very cool. That's a great story as to how that came about.
Yeah.
So the new book, The Hopeful Family, Raising Resilient Children in Uncertain Times, comes out January 18th. And that will be published by Church Publishing, Inc. So tell us a little bit about how that book came about.
That book came about as I was wrestling alongside of parents and kids about what hope looks like in this time. And this wrestling started pre-pandemic. I got my book contract in March of last year, so just as the pandemic was beginning. So a lot of this thinking had been going on earlier, and it was starting in part around eco-anxiety and climate change, and hearing a lot of questions from parents and kids alike about what is life going to look like. And in that, I heard this question of hope. What do we hope for? What does theological hope look like when everything seems really uncertain? And we're talking about what may be really an existential crisis. So how do we talk about hope in those kinds of terms? So from there is where I started looking at what hope means, looking at how we live well in uncertain times, and started pulling that together in this framework of spiritual practices and connecting them to practices of resilience.
So tell us a little bit about how the book is structured and why you chose to do it that way.
I structured it around 9 spiritual practices. And some of those I knew already that I wanted to write about. I knew that I wanted to write about meals and food and how rituals and home practices around how we eat shape our hopefulness and our resilience. I knew that I wanted to write about Sabbath and how we need to be making time for real rest and why that is an act of hope as well as an act of justice. And then other practices came to me as ways, as frameworks of looking at these mental health practices through a Christian lens. So looking at hospitality as a way of welcoming the stranger, and I talk about that and this justice work that's inherent in hospitality, but also how are we hospitable to ourselves? How do we treat ourselves in a way that we can rebound from mistakes? How do we deal with these fears that we're having? So I took these 9 spiritual practices and kind of connected the dots with other ways that we know that we can be shaped into being resilient people.
Interesting. Well, when the pandemic hit last March, I started an interview series called Faith, Hope, and Love called Reading Hope in Trying Times. And I wish your book would have been available then, because that would have been a perfect fit for that interview series. But, so that was one of the things that was many of the interviews that we talked about was, where do we find hope during a pandemic? And you were writing the book during the pandemic about hope. So how was that mental model for you?
It was intense and it was amazing. I wasn't anticipating writing it as quickly as I did. Of course, it so rarely happens in publishing that my book is coming out less than a year than I got the contract. And
that is rare.
That is not typical. So at first I was kind of like, oh my gosh, can I do this? There's a lot going on. And so that was the part that was intense. On the other hand, I can't imagine doing it any other way, because it became for me its own spiritual practice of really being immersed into these things. I have a daughter. She's 13. And so in some ways it also just kind of became like this lab, like, here I am claiming that these spiritual practices can shape us into living hopefully in uncertain times. And I have this opportunity to practice right now. So does it really work? And I found that it made amazing shifts in our lives, just these few simple kind of anchors in our day. So it was a blessing, to use that word, really, to do this book at this time.
Well, I'm sure that it's a blessing for lots of people, because we're still in it now, right? I mean,
yes.
So, and that's going to be the case for a while. So I'm sure it's very helpful for a lot of folks. So in the book, you describe what you call unifying practices. What do you mean by that?
One of the things that really spoke to me about spiritual practices, or has spoken to me about spiritual practices through my ministry, is the way that they aren't doctrinal. So you can do a spiritual practice without fully having to articulate what you believe. And you can do spiritual practices with people from other faith traditions.
Mm.
So many faith traditions share many of these spiritual practices.
Hmm.
And I think that's really helpful in a time when we are looking for ways to be unified, more unified. It's also, my husband is not a particularly religious person, and I have several families in my congregation who one spouse has a different faith experience, whether they're an interfaith marriage or one of them is atheist and the other is, attending church every Sunday. And so I was also really paying attention to that as what does it look like to shape family life in a way that's faithful, but also allows everybody to participate.
That is really good to hear. And I can imagine it being very useful in many situations.
Yeah, I hope so. It has been useful in our house and for some of the families that I've kind of had try this in that type of setting.
So you also describe these practices as embodied theology. What do you mean by that?
That's where I came to this idea of hope within these practices. I mean, spiritual practices have been part of Christian tradition for so long and part of religious traditions overall for so long. I hadn't fully thought of them as being practices of hope before. But as I looked at them, what I saw in them is that these ways of shaping our lives let us live into hope, even when we aren't quite sure what that means. Even when we might not be able to articulate exactly what it is that hope means, or exactly what hope looks like tomorrow, or even what are we hoping for. These are ways that we live hopefully. And I think of hope as knowing that we can live meaningfully, even in uncertain times. But I also love this idea of hope that a child actually gave to me. And they said, hope is love plus courage.
That's good.
And I just thought that is so amazing. What an amazing way to think about hope. And so that's how we can live it, even when we don't quite know it. And I think the way that we sometimes think that we have to know what we think, and then we're going to act on that. And that's way oversimplified. It's really more cyclical. So thinking about the actions that we take and how that shapes us into being hopeful people. That's what I'm thinking about when I think about embodied theology.
Very cool. I love that. The wisdom of babes, right?
Oh, so rich.
So, this was the first kind of like adult book that you wrote. How did that process go for you, and what kind of surprises did you find through that?
It is like anything. There's just so much learning about things at multiple levels when it comes to writing a book. So I'd been through writing articles. I'd worked with editors at that level before. I think I expected it to be more like that. And it is, but it isn't. There's just a difference in it. There's a difference in the way that things are shaped as you're in conversation with your editor. And I loved that. And it was also a change. I almost said challenging, and it wasn't really a challenging, but it was a change, just to work through that process and to understand that some of what I was learning was how to write a book, as well as learning what are these spiritual practices.
The content, yeah, the process and the content. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. A lot of folks, I think, go through that same process experience, of okay, this is a new thing of trying to do this.
Yeah.
But it's really admirable that you got it done so quickly.
Thank you.
Seriously. I mean, that's not typical.
It's not. And I have said to my editor, who was Wendy Claire Berry, who I loved working with, that I work well like that. So
Under pressure?
under pressure. So in some ways, it was great. I'm a sprinter. That's how I sometimes describe it. I'm a sprinter, not a marathon runner. So even if I
Wow.
had, a year, I'm not a procrastinator, so I probably wouldn't have waited until the end of the year, but I would have wanted to sit down and get it done right away anyway. So that part was okay, but it is still an added pressure to know you're not working ahead of time.
Interesting. So within the book, there's a lot of ties between your research on mental health and well-being with, spirituality. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm fascinated at multiple levels by that connection. And I think for a time, those fields were more connected. I mean, they weren't really fields, right? Uh, Religion caught a lot of these mental health kinds of ideas, for better or for worse. And as they became their own fields of religion and psychology, some of that got divorced. But I think what we're really seeing now is people looking at how those are integrated again in different ways. And one of the things that set off my thinking about that, even though I was interested in that already from some of the work that I had been doing, one of the things that brought me back to that was I was at a mental health lecture conference. And one of the presenters said something about forgiveness being the great gift of religious traditions to psychology, that there was so much of a breakthrough in psychological work as they began to look at forgiveness and what they were able to do with people in their mental health, that it kind of made me wonder, well, where else is that true? Just maybe not necessarily quite so black and white, but where else are there connections?
Cool. Well, I'm seeing more and more interest in that general area. There's another couple of authors, early stage authors, who I've been in contact with that are doing things, generally speaking, in the relationship between mental health and spirituality. So that's good to know. I mean, there's so many topics that have been taboo, in varying degrees, that finally now are being talked about more.
Yeah.
And that's one of them. Mental health area is one of them. So it's a good thing.
It is a good thing. I think so. And even just some of that early on, recently, but early on in this thinking about that, even identifying that kids who had some sort of spiritual background, and that was labeled very broadly, had better coping skills. Those kinds of things where we're not sure why exactly, but we are seeing that these things are more connected than maybe we have fully explored in the past.
Well, certainly, having strong role models, right? Spiritual role models included, is really an important thing for any child. So, that's got to be a key aspect of that, I think.
I think so too. And I think community can be, if a community of faith is part of that spirituality. I also
Absolutely.
think there's real power in the big picture stories that come up in faith traditions. Those sacred stories give us a way of locating ourselves in these difficult times, that I think is so important for everybody. But also I really see kids tapping into those and using those inspirationally.
So without divulging any proprietary too early information or anything like that, can you tell us anything about the future projects that you're working on?
I have in mind a possibility for another children's book. That is in early stages, even in my thinking. So, so I'm not sure exactly where that would head, but I do want to look some more about theology with children. Then this book is very much written in a way that I hope that parents, church educators that it's actionable. That's my hope for it. That's part of why it's looked at through spiritual practices. But there is something powerful for me in figuring out how to speak directly to kids
Hmm. Hmm.
as well. And so I'm playing around with some of that for the future.
Excellent. That'll be really good to see when it comes out.
Thank you.
And as we discussed earlier, I've begun doing Christian children's book conferences.
Mm.
So you'll have to keep us posted so that maybe you can participate in one of those.
I would love to. That would be wonderful.
Well, Amelia, thank you so much for all of your work and for joining us to talk about your latest book.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled. Just again, I admire your work and I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you.